I gotta start the recording. Hey everyone, welcome to our final workshop this weekend. This is Peter. He's here to give a really in-depth crash course on graphics design. He's really experienced and he works with us on the core team at XdHacks Mini. He's helped out teach a lot of the people who've come in through our other rounds about graphics design and using Inkscape. And this project that you're doing, especially this for the next few weeks, or sorry, for the next week, will be heavily reliant on graphics design, as putting together a really good website with a very holistic kind of view, and being able to have everything put together well requires some good aesthetics and understanding some really basic graphic design concepts and being able to create some really intuitive graphic designs. So Peter is here today to give you a little tutorial on, design thinking and many other things besides that as well. So make sure you've downloaded Inkscape. Peter has expressed that if you haven't done so already, there is time during this first part of the presentation to do so. But there is like a mini project at the end, so you'll want to make sure you get that so you can, get a bit of help from someone who's very experienced with graphics design. So without further,
actually, before I start, is there a way to check the participants here?
Yeah, if you go,
is there a way for them to communicate? Because I want to, for the mini project, I want to have them vote on like an idea on what to do. Because I was thinking maybe the participants should decide what they should make. So we'll have like a vote, I guess. So right now there's 8 participants. It says up
I can set up a poll.
Okay, we have attendees. I see. Okay, cool. So that's fine.
Yeah, we have a Q&A, and if you want, I can set up a poll.
Okay.
Oh wait, no, polls don't let custom answers. Never mind. So yeah.
Is there like, if there's a way that they can type into like a chat box, that'll be great. Like for Twitch, something like that.
There is a chat box, and there's also a Q&A thing.
Okay.
So I guess when the time comes, when you guys have to decide on your mini project, you guys can just kind of pop your ideas into the Q&A.
Okay, perfect.
And I guess from there, Peter, we can get started on this.
All right, cool. I'll just take it away then.
Yep, I'll take off my video and.
Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome to the graphics design workshop where I'll just be talking about some of the fundamentals of graphics design. My name is Peter, and I'm the design director for XdHacks core team, so the worldwide team for XdHacks Mini and stuff. So that's how I got here. In the next like 2 or 3 hours, I don't know, we'll learn something about graphics design, the purpose of it, and some hard skills to do to make actual graphics out of. And I'll be talking about some of the theory as well. So just a little bit of a disclaimer before we begin. I'm not an actual graphics designer at all. I'm studying aerospace engineering. I'm more of a STEM person, but like starting from like grade 7, I've developed a liking for graphics design and for a lot of the more practical side of it. And I've been doing that for like 5 years. So I have some experience. Everything I'll be saying here will be from my experience and from my own research. So I'm not an actual designer. If there's an actual designer here, I'll probably be roasted for the rest of the day. So yeah, not everything I say is actual like design school stuff. However, that is also, I guess, a little bit of an encouraging thing because you really don't need to take university courses or actual design classes to learn how to do the really basic stuff. So yeah, let's get into it and let's start learning about graphics design. So first of all, I guess first question, what the hell is graphics design? That's what I asked myself when I first started, and usually that's what people approach this, because like people think, is this an art or is this more of a hard skill, more of a following procedures thing? So yeah, what is graphics design? I believe at the heart of it, graphics design is a craft where professionals create visual content to communicate messages. So I don't think it's the same as the visual art, not exactly, because it deals in more effective communication and not much in complete creativity. Art is more interpretable. It's more to make the viewer think, while effective graphics design is more for communicating the same message reliably and quickly. Of course, creativity is still very important in graphics design. It helps getting the message across. It helps garner interest. However, it's not exactly just to make people think. It's to communicate a singular and very precise message. All right. So now you know what kind of the basics of graphics design is. Like, let's get into some of the techniques I'll talk about a little bit later. So the one that I find very common nowadays and used a lot and really easy to make and really easy to animate, but is effective, is called flat design. So if you see on the screen here, this is the Kurzgesagt. This is an animation that uses flat design. And it's very effective. It gets the message across, and it's relatively simple to make and simple to animate. And there's another style that's recently become more popular as well. It's called isometric design. So it's similar to flat design, that it uses flat colors, but it uses an optical illusion of a three-dimensional space. So this could also be made in a 2D software, but it looks more 3D, and recently it's become more popular. So both of these are very efficient for communicating messages, as it is easy and it's very scalable and used quite a lot in modern web development workflows. So since you guys are doing that, I'm going to be talking about these two more in depth later. So that's the two styles that we'll get into. Keep that in mind. All right. So now, after we've gotten through the two basic styles, let's talk about some more theory here. We got to talk about what really to include in a graphical representation, because when you're making something like a logo, what do you want to put in the logo is very important. Obviously, logos will have to have things in it. So we're going to talk about what to include and how like good logos work. So let's talk about the theory of that. So yeah, before we get into any techniques and details, when you make a graphics, you need things to put into. So let's start learning about what things work. So logos should be kept simple. I have a recent, for a very long time, I've been very interested in flags. Only more recently have I gotten into logos, but I find there's a lot of transfer of techniques. So keep logos simple. So a 5-year-old can draw it when it's hanging off of a flagpole, because your logos aren't going to be viewed up close all the time. Your logos will be hanging off of buildings, will be maybe plastered on the side of a plane or on a flag and a flagpole somewhere high. And you want it to be memorable, and you want it so that any person could see it and draw it. So, and you want it not only to be simple, but also you want it to be recognizable after it's been hand drawn. So after it's been even more simplified by some kids sketching it, you still want that to be recognizable as your logo. So after considering all of those things which make a logo usable, I was thinking it almost shares all of its traits with a flag. So like, what else do you want to be on a flagpole that a 5-year-old could draw? A flag, of course, for a country or for a city. So yeah, there's a lot of sharing of ideas between designing a flag and designing a good logo. So yeah, let's talk about some good flags. Right here, this is a very good flag. This is the flag of Estonia. As you can see, it's just a tricolor with blue on top, black in the middle, and a stripe of white on the bottom. However, just like a good logo, it has to convey a meaning. And usually a flag of a country will have to convey the meaning of a country, which is a very abstract concept, just like a lot of logos. They need to communicate an abstract concept. However, this flag does a really good job, because if I go to the next slide, it represents the land of Estonia very, very well. If you go back, that's the flag. And here's a picture of a snow-covered lake with a tree line, a forest, and then on top you have the sky, which is very common in Estonia because it's a northern European country. It's quite cold. So that's what it's supposed to represent. It represents the land of Estonia with the sky, the forest, and the snow in a very simple way, that someone could memorize within 5 seconds and draw it up. So it's a very successful flag. And I believe logos should also follow this idea, because if you have something that is simple, that's memorable, that also conveys the message effectively, I would think that it's very effective for a logo as well. So let's look at another good flag. Right here, this is the flag of the city of Amsterdam. I also really like this flag because this flag is very distinct. It has the 3 crosses of St. Andrews on it, and it's actually a simplified version of its coat of arms. So in more old times, you have a coat of arms of the city in a lot of places, and people would have that recognition. And then now when you turn it into a more simplified modern flag, there's this connection between the coat of arms and the flag. But at the same time, this flag also has another meaning, that even though it's by accident, I find it helps a lot of people memorize this flag, because the 3 crosses of St. Andrews, they look like X's. And the city of Amsterdam is known for their red light district. So that made a lot of people memorize this flag extremely well, because, well, there's the other connection. It's completely by accident, but it's a very strong connection that people will make. So this right here is very effective as a logo, because it draws connections with people's brains and it helps them memorize it very, very clearly. You want a logo that you see it once you relate it to the company, and that relation never really goes away. So yeah, we talked about flags and how they can make logos good, like the relations of a good flag and a good logo. I'm going to show you a very, very bad flag, which also is a very bad logo. So right here, this right here is the flag of Pocatello. This is a terrible flag. It's too complicated. It's got nothing is centered on this, and when it's hanging off of a flagpole, there's very little chance that someone could see it once and be able to sketch it out by memory. So this also makes a bad logo. When your logo is hanging off the building or something that's moving, you want the person to see it and be able to connect it to the company and memorize it. With something like this, it'll never happen. So designing an unsuccessful logo is just like designing an unsuccessful flag. So avoid being Pocatello. Don't be Pocatello. Very bad. So yeah, that's basically what I like to make when I talk about logos. Make logos. Designing a successful logo is similar to the designing of successful flags. The most successful flags are the ones you see everywhere. They're simple, they're memorable, and they're easy to be put onto things. So make your logos simple, but have some sort of representation of your company. So it also makes a connection, just like the Amsterdam flag, just like the Estonia flag. You make a connection in your mind immediately after seeing this logo. So you want it to be simple, and you want it to represent something that makes a connection. So that's the logos. And now let's look at some logos that are actually good. So good logos also work with their name. So you can see you make a connection. It says this is a logo of Aperture Science. If any one of you played Portal before, you know Aperture Science. That's the main company that you're always playing inside that does all the testing. But they have really good logos. A good logo works with their name, just like a flag would. The flag of Estonia works by representing the country of Estonia. The logo of Aperture Science is very relatable to the idea of the name Aperture Science. It looks like an aperture. So that really helps connect in the human brain. And also, because it connects with the name and the iconography works, it can be evolved without losing meaning. You have the 1950s logo on the left with Aperture Science. That's 1950s with the aperture and an atom on the inside. It's aperture, and atoms usually represent science. So that's very easy to recognize iconography that works with the name. And then the modern logo, which keeps the aperture. So you can easily draw a connection and you can see a logical evolution of the logo. And the logo still makes sense after an evolution of it. That's a fictional example, of course. Let's look at a real life example. We have Shell, which is oil company from the Netherlands. This right here is a very good example of a evolution of a logo that continues to make sense. Starting from 1900, you have a shell, and then 1904, and then all the way onward, it always remains this shell, which obviously works because the name of the company is Shell, and you're showing a shell. So that easily makes the connection. And it's simple, and anyone knows what a shell is. So they can make that connection very easily. So yeah, that's the shell example. That's our real life example of good logo. So yeah, after we go over the logos, so logos need to be simple. They need to make connections. They need to represent the company in a very clear way that is memorable. We now go into some more complex graphics, and we got to talk about the theory behind that as well. So yeah, what about more complex graphics like posters or promotional advertisements? There's a lot more going on. So what now? So let's get into that. So please know, just know, this is not what we want to do. So yeah, this is a very problematic thing that happens quite a lot. So avoid drawing people. I really don't like the idea of drawing a bunch of happy people going around moving, because also just because they take a long time, people are hard to draw. But also avoid these long-armed, uncanny creatures of people, because they're associated with a lot of the quote-unquote big tech corporate art style, which is actually limiting your capability to communicate. Because again, graphics design is a method of communication. So a lot of times when you want to communicate an ideal, but because it's already stereotyped with a cold, sterile, not consumer-friendly big tech company, then you're already associating yourself with that nature of being very cold and sterile and anti-consumer. So even though if you're trying to communicate like a happy message using these people that look weird and have these long arms, it won't be effective. It won't be effective communication, because people will just associate it with big tech companies, even if you're not trying to communicate that sterile and big tech message. If you're like a startup or something, you want to communicate more of a message where you want to be a small company. If you're doing something like this, people are already kind of associated with these big companies in their brains. So it's not actually effective communication. So please don't do this. Not only is it ineffective, it also takes quite a while to do, and it just looks unnatural with these big, disproportionately made people. So I certainly do not recommend something like this. Okay. Next, we talk about everyday objects. So in a poster, everyday objects could be very important. Everyday objects are good for making design look comfy and relatable, and it makes the consumer, relate to the objects, because a lot of these objects, if you have them on a graphic that's also in the viewer's home, it'll help the viewer relate with the graphic itself. And when we're talking about this, I would like to deviate a little bit away from graphic design again and into the creation of Soviet propaganda. So we're talking about everyday objects, and we're talking about relatability. So the Soviet government might not be best. They're cruel, they're inefficient, but their designers were certainly quite brilliant. They made citizens relate to a revolution in political ideology that isn't really something everyone understands, but they converted it to a message in propaganda that everyone understands. Now, everyone understood the complex geopolitics and differing ideologies during the Russian Revolution, but everyone understood wheat and farming and food and having to eat food. So they made a very abstract idea of a political revolution and used these graphical representations of, say right here, you have the wheat farmers and the people who are eating the wheat. With a very simple graphical representation, they turned that political struggle, that very abstract concept, into a grounded concept relating to agriculture and food. And that made the masses of the Soviet population, or the region's population, they weren't Soviets yet during the revolution, but they made the masses of agricultural workers and people just relate to this political ideology because they're using this everyday object that everyone relates to. So I believe that we can learn a lot from this by having the ability to connect abstract idea to a real life concept that is less abstract. It helps a lot with, grounding your concepts, grounding your ideas, and getting people to relate with whatever you're trying to tell them. Now, we go from the more everyday objects, we go to the more not everyday objects. We talk about moving objects. So yeah, moving objects such as trains, planes, ships, spacecraft even, they're very different from the mundane objects that we talked about. They, on the other hand, signify progress and revolution instead of relatability. You can see here, I'm sourcing some of the old train posters. So yeah, like train posters from the 1930s, for example, 1920s, 1930s, use this very well. They use these abstract designs of very fast-moving objects and very grand, fast-moving trains, for example, to communicate this future, this progress that the train companies want people to know. And same with space exploration. So I found these two posters that are for NASA space missions. You have Rosetta, which is a comet mission, and Cassini, which is the Saturn mission. And these, of course, they are these big moving space probes, and they signify progress and exploration of the cosmos. It's a very different feel to the relatable everyday object, but it can also be very important for design. So for something like this, I would also like to take a look at the A.M. Cassandra, which is a French painter. His posters from the 1930s. These are extremely, extremely well done, in my opinion. So you can see here, we have a train, and then we have a very big ship, and then we have another train. These things look like they're in motion. There's a lot of use of perspective here to make them look extremely grand, and it just conveys the idea of progress, of futurism. So if you want to have conveying a similar idea of progress and futurism, it's great to include these moving, usually transportation objects, things that are moving at a rapid pace. And same with the space race. The moving objects often appear in the imagery of the space race, which also evokes the idea of progress, of the exploration of the unknown, of our future, humanity's future, that type of deal. So by having these moving objects, having these lines and having these big things moving, it really signifies the idea of progress. So yeah, those are some interesting graphical representations that I, from experience, found were very useful in posters and in iconography. So yeah, now let's actually talk about flat design. We've done enough of the general theory. We should talk about some of the actual elements of flat design, because I was talking about learning flat design in the beginning of this lecture. So yeah, let's get into flat design. So first, let's talk about some of flat design's origins. A lot of the elements that we call flat design today originated from the 1920s, from things like Art Deco. So if you've seen something like The Great Gatsby, that era, the 1920s, has a lot of Art Deco. and also the German design school called Bauhaus. So yeah, these two design philosophies really made up what we call flat design today. Oh, sorry, my brother's playing the piano. So just 1 second. Let me close the door. I apologize for that. So yeah, so that's the origin story of what we call modern flat design. And let's actually get into what flat design is. So as the name suggests, flat design is completely flat, what we call orthographic projection. So you can see right here, this is a three-dimensional object in the middle. The three-dimensional object featuring what looks like a button on a rectangular prism. So that is what we call an isometric projection or a three-dimensional looking projection. However, that's not what flat design is. Flat design is an orthographic projection. You can see on the left, you have the top view, the front view, and the side view. All three of those are orthographic projections. They're completely flat cutouts of the things we're looking at. That's what flat design is. It's a completely flat projection, unlike isometric projection, where we will get into later. So yeah, that's flat projection, and that'll be what the basis of flat design is. So when you're making a flat design drawing, there is no perspective, and it's always just everything in a flat plane. And when I see flat design, there's usually kind of two main overarching styles that people like to use. There's the quote-unquote modern style, and then there's the quote-unquote retro style. The modern style really developed in the 2010s by having a lot of shading and a lot of rounded corners. So think Kurzgesagt. It's a very good YouTube channel that does animation. This YouTube channel uses modern flat design. So right here, this is a screenshot above the modern. That's a screenshot of an animation from this animation studio. And this right here, this is modern flat design. So it has more shading and it has a lot of rounded corners. So you can see here, all the corners here, even the clouds, the ground, the mountains, the people here standing, the rockets, they're all rounded corners. So that is the more modern style. And then we get to the more quote unquote retro style. So this is more based off of the style that's developed in the 1970s for flat design. So it has sharp corners, you can see, sharp corners, and it has gradients. So you can see the sun here, this is a gradient. Also below the number 40 right here, this is a gradient. So there are sharp angles, while the more modern style usually uses rounded corners. The 70s retro looking style, quote unquote, uses more sharp angles and uses more gradients. So yeah, there's less shading, there's sharp corners and lines and lots of gradient for the 1970s stuff. And there's just a lot of rounded corners and rounded angles in the more modern style. Both work very well. You could have a preference, obviously, but I feel both could look extremely good when done right. So yeah, the rounded style looks more modern, and in some ways I feel like a little bit more corporate, but the angular style looks more retro. So it evokes more of a traditional flat design style, and it evokes the idea of, the 1970s, 1980s. And of course, there's the Bauhaus, where I talked about the Bauhaus earlier as one of the origins of flat design. But again, that's also making a comeback today. So here are some interesting examples. These are Bauhaus designs of modern logos. So they hired some graphics designers, I guess, to redesign their modern logos to the Bauhaus design, just I guess maybe for fun or for some sort of exhibition. And it's very interesting. You can see Apple on the left and Burger King on the right. And these are very indicative of a Bauhaus design, which uses unsaturated colors. So to make something look like a Bauhaus design, you want to have unsaturated colors, like you can see the Burger King one. All the yellows, the blues are not very strongly saturated. You want to have a bold sans serif font. You can see Apple and Burger King here are very bolded sans serif fonts. And also the usage of a lot of geometric shapes. The apple right here is just a semi-sphere and a sphere. And you have Burger King here, which is all flat, but it's made up of lines and circles. So yeah, to replicate the Bauhaus design, like replicating the modern design where you use rounded corners, or when you replicate the 1970s style, you use shading and gradients, and you use sharp corners. For the Bauhaus style, you use more of geometric shapes, and you use washed out colors that are not very saturated. So those are, I guess, the really basics of flat design. And I'll talk about how to actually do it in the second part of this workshop a little bit later. But that's basically the theory and the general look of flat design. Now, let's get into isometric design. So we talked about flat design, which is flat and uses orthographic projection. We now talk about isometric design, which uses 3D looking projections. And the secret to isometric design is 30-degree angles. So yeah, isometric design is a 3D-like projection by turning an object on a 30 degrees on all three axes. So you can see here in the middle of the page, we have our flat projections. And then on the left side of the page, we have our isometric projection. So yeah, how does one draw a 2D, in a 2D software, something that looks 3D? The use of equilateral triangles are extremely helpful because when you turn a cube 30 degrees on all three axes, you end up with something that looks roughly like a hexagon. And that's why when you have equilateral triangles, when you draw on them, it'll just appear to be objects that are tilted 30 degrees in all three axes. So yeah, in an isometric design, basically all the angles are 60 to 120 degrees. More on that later. But yeah, that's how we make isometric projection, is by projecting something that's 30 degrees offset. So 30 degrees offset on all three axes by angle. And you use equilateral triangles to help you draw. So yeah, isometric design has recently become a bit of a design trend. It's become very popular. And you can see here on the right of the page, there's a logo that uses an isometric cube looking icon. And that's mostly because a lot of modern graphics design softwares have isometric grids now. When I was talking about the 30-degree angles and the equilateral triangles, that could be done on a computer. And you can see on the icon on the picture on the left, the grid right here is all equilateral triangles. And when you trace the equilateral triangles, you get this nice isometric look. So that's why it's become more popular. You can do this on the computer. I will actually go over with that on Inkscape later. So if you want to have an isometric design on Inkscape, you can have equilateral triangles in a grid, and I'll go over that later. And also the other advantage of isometric design is that it is it's a significantly easier alternative to traditional perspective drawings. So when you have like old railroad posters that I was showing and the old ship posters, they were using traditional perspective, which is a technique that's brought in from painting and from more fine arts fields. And perspective is very complicated and very time consuming because you have different vanishing points. In the picture in the center, you can see there are 4 vanishing points, and all 4 vanishing points dictate the perspective of the drawing. And you have to draw perspective lines from the vanishing points so that everything you sketch will match said perspective. For isometric design, it might not look as good, but you don't actually have to worry about vanishing points and focal length in isometric because the grid is actually infinite. Right here, you can see the grid is infinite and there's no actual vanishing points and no perspective, unlike the other 3D designs which have perspective. So that makes isometric a lot easier and a lot faster, where you can just trace off of equilateral triangles. And I guess that's it for the really short rundown into both flat and isometric design. I'll go over how to make them later in the second part of the workshop, but let's keep going with the theory. The last part of the theory that I want to talk about that I felt really helped when I was first starting out is the use of mathematics. It might sound a little bit confusing that mathematics would get into a graphics design field, but it's actually extremely important. The first part of mathematics that is important is the understanding of ratios and resolution. So you have commonly used resolutions that people talk about, like 1080p and 720p, but a lot of people don't actually understand what the ratio is and how it actually works. So 1080p is actually 1920 pixels by 1080 pixels. So 1920 pixels wide and 1080 pixels tall. And that's a ratio of 16 by 9. So basically, if you want to make something that will work for 1080p, that will rescale to 1080p correctly, you have to make a drawing that's 16 by 9. And that's how you get 1080p or 720p. It's all 16 by 9. And that's a common screen resolution ratio as well. So when you make a graphic, you can consider the ratio. 16 by 9 is very useful because it appears on most computer screens and it appears on most of our standard resolution. And it's not just computers. We also talk about printing because if you make graphics, you might also make graphics on physical posters. So printing is actually quite interesting. You've heard of the A series paper with A0, A1, A2, A3, A4, all those paper sizes. The ratio of those paper sizes are 1 by 1.414. The more mathematically keen people will know that it's actually 1 by the square root of 2. It's a ratio that ensures when you divide the paper by 2, it retains its ratio. So an A2 paper will be the same ratio, 1 by 1.414, as an A1 paper, because the longer line and the shorter line's ratio is the square root of 2 ratio. So that means you can infinitely divide a piece of paper like the A series paper in half and continue getting the same ratio. So an A4 paper is the same length to width ratio as an A0 paper, as an A7 paper, as an A2 paper, because of this ratio. So if you draw a drawing in 1.4014 by 1 ratio, it'll be able to print on all of the A size papers. So that's extremely good to know because most of the printing, such as big posters, will be done in this ratio. So yeah, that's one very important part of understanding the mathematics of graphics design is the ratios and resolution. The other part is geometry. So people like geometry and ratios. It's aesthetically pleasing for people, and it's generally just very clean looking for when you use these mathematical ratios and geometry and shapes. So I guess it goes into a little bit of the idea of the existence of mathematics, the mathematical realism, the idea that mathematics would exist outside of humans and exist in nature. I do believe humans definitely evolved to like mathematical ratios because they existed in nature. So this evolutionary trait stayed. So people still today do really enjoy when graphics are mathematically precise and use mathematical ratios and geometry. You can see here, I got back to AM Cassandra again from the ship posters. AM Cassandra really likes using these geometric grid lines and representations before he colors them in. So you can see on the left side of the page, you have a finished graphic with the lines showing. But on the right side, you can see what he sketched out before he colored everything in. It was all of these mathematically precise geometric shapes. And then all you have to do is color it in, and you would get a very aesthetically pleasing graphic. So yeah, because of that, my suggestion for all of you is to divide the page into grids with lines. So on flat design, you want to usually divide the page into squares and right isosceles triangles. So you can see on the left side of the page, that's usually for flat design, something like that. You use circles, squares, and isosceles triangles to divide the page. And you want to divide the page into 3s or 10s because those are mathematical ratios that people like. So that's what you divide the page for flat design. And for isometric design, of course, because it's that 30-degree angle rotation, everything looks like equilateral triangles or hexagon projection. So you have equilateral triangles on your grid, and you draw off of that. So you want to do that for both flat and isometric design. And also, before you even start, there's this, I learned this from photography, it's called the rule of 3. It's just to divide the grid, the page into a grid of 3s, or basically divide the page into 9 squares or rectangles by having 2 vertical lines and 2 horizontal lines. Because the middle in the rule of 3, the middle little box inside that box of 9 is usually where the person sees first. So by dividing your page into a grid, you'll separate everything into a visual hierarchy. So that's the other important part for like the grid is visual hierarchy. People usually see things in the middle that are biggest. So by having a grid, it'll help you visualize this visual hierarchy. That's also very, very important. So yeah, that is the dividing the page and the grid and all of the use of mathematics. And that will be the end of the first part of my, my workshop. So we went over all the theory stuff. In the next part of the lecture, we'll have a 5-minute break. And in the next part of the lecture, we will have I'll share my screen and we'll actually go over Inkscape. So if any one of you haven't installed Inkscape yet, please do that now in the 5-minute break. And when I return, we'll all launch Inkscape and I will share my screen with Inkscape on, and we'll actually learn the hard skills on how to create the flat and isometric design. And then after that, we'll have the third part of our workshop where I'll assign all of you a mini project where we will vote on it and we'll all make something interesting. So yeah, right now will be our 5-minute break. I'll be back in like 5 minutes. I'll take a drink of water and we'll begin our Inkscape part of this workshop. Thank you guys. I'll be back. I just went to take a cup of water. So I guess since it's like the break time right now, if any one of you have questions about the first section of the workshop, you can feel free to put them in the Q&A right now. I'll answer the questions about this like theory part first, and then we'll get to the Inkscape part. Also, I'm sorry.
Yeah, what we can do, I don't think we can do the speaking in the webinar, but what I can do is I can go make a new meeting link, and that way you guys will all be able to be like able to share your screens. Everyone will be able to share the screens and talk as well.
Yeah,
You want me to do that?
I think for the next section, we want everyone to be able to communicate. I just feel like, especially because we're going to be learning about Inkscape, there's going to be a lot of questions. So I want to be able to answer them fast.
Okay. The only problem is, remember last time you couldn't share your screen on it.
Oh, it should be fine, I think.
Okay. So
I don't know.
I'll make a new link then. Let me pause the recording here.